Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out today. Welcome to this edition of Humanities in Session here at the Center for Humanities Research. My name is Luando Scott, for those who don't know, which I don't think is anyone here, and I'm a senior researcher here at the center. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here to what promises to be an invigorating conversation. Let me begin by introductions before we kind of get into the thick of things, as it were. I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers before I share a few words myself. Jordache Ellapen is an associate professor of feminist studies in culture and media at the University of Toronto. And over the past 2 years, 2024 to 2026, he has also served as an associate professor of Black studies at the University of Rochester, upstate New York, if I'm correct. With graduate training in both South Africa and the United States, Ellapen's work lies at the intersection of global Black studies, feminist and queer studies, visual culture, and performance studies. He has a particular interest in the making of race within the Indian Ocean world and tracing genealogies of Blackness beyond the Atlantic world. He is the author of the book Indenture Aesthetics, Afro-Indian Femininities and the Queer Limits of the South African Blackness. This is the book under discussion today. It was published by Duke University Press last year. Of course, he has written numerous articles, award-winning articles I might include, including Siakaka Feminism, African Anality and the Politics of Deviance in Faka's Performance Art Praxis. This was published by Feminist Studies. In responding to Jordache today, we have this soon-to-be Dr. Pralini Naidu, whom I think is the perfect interlocutor for this conversation. Pralini is a poet, a storyteller, a writing facilitator, and an editor. She recently, as I've alluded, recently submitted her PhD through the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Her research focuses on the erased and hidden narratives of women descended from indenture in South Africa and explores their relationship to land, to sea, food, and the more than human. She is the author of Wild Has Roots, a collection of poems, reflections, and short stories. Her work has appeared in Tiesta Review, Biko magazine, anthology, Women's Poetry of Indian and South Africa, Dreams as Revolution Art Book, and Pluriversal Conversations as on Transnational Feminism. Her poetry centers on the spiritual and meditative practice of being present in everyday life and on what she calls poetic noticing. Through poetry and storytelling, she has facilitated workshops and retreats for women on the margins of society who seek to reclaim their voices. So, before I give to Jordache, perhaps to say more about Jordache and about the book that is under discussion today. Jordache is no stranger to me, nor is he a stranger to the Center for Humanities Research. I think the last time I saw Jordache was in 2019 when I traveled to Toronto on a fellowship that is organized between the Center for Humanities Research and the Jackman Humanities Institute. It was my first international trip, I think, between when I arrived at the Center for Humanities Research. And while it was incredibly freezing in Toronto, it was also an incredibly productive and formative experience. And of course, a few months after I returned from Toronto, the world shut down on the onset of the pandemic. During my time in Toronto, I became familiar with Jordache's work on performance and aesthetic practices. Particularly, I was interested in his engagement with black queer femme duo Faga, consisting of Desire Morea and Fela Gucci. I mention this because there are important points of convergence between Jordache's work and my own. As many of you will recall, a few months ago, I presented a talk here titled Queerness, Blackness, and the Post-Colony, in which I examined the music and the visual cultures of Black queer artists, Nakane and Desire Morea, in which I examined this music and the visual cultures of these Black queer artists through the lens of queer futurities in Africa. Part of that analysis focused on Desire Morea's particular music video called You Think I'm Horny, where I explored questions of Black queer aesthetics. So I'm saying this to say there are synergies, there are overlaps, and of course, there are productive divergences between our respective engagements with queer aesthetics, with Black aesthetics, indenture aesthetics, and femme aesthetics. It is precisely these intersections and tensions that make today's conversations so exciting. So when we were discussing the possibility of hosting Jordache, our senior colleague, Professor Patricia Hayes, suggested that we bring along copies of Chronos, the volume that contains Jordache's photo essay. So I have about 6 or so copies for those who might be interested in them. Unfortunately, we know the Academy is in the business of business, so they are 150 each, if anyone wants a copy. Unfortunately, Professor Hayes is unable to join us, as is our director, Associate Professor Moritz van Boverdonker. Both have expressed great enthusiasm, I might say, at the prospect of Jordache speaking here today. They are both currently in France, so I don't feel too sorry for them, on separate academic engagements. So on behalf of them, myself, and all my colleagues, some of which are here, I would like to extend a very, very warm welcome to you, Jordache, to the Center for Humanities Research. So in closing my welcome, the work that Jordache will be sharing with us today, which of course I don't need to speak on, but maybe just a sentence or two. In this work, he traces various aesthetic forms of blackening that queer and heteronativist parameters of South African Blackness and Indianness in order to rethink the positionality of the Afro-Indian in relation to South African Blackness. With this, I'm particularly myself now fascinated by the concept of Afro-normativity and the way it helps us to understand how new formations of race, particularly Blackness, intersect with normative understandings of gender, of sexuality, and class that produce the figure of the authentic Black subject in post-apartheid South Africa. And as someone who has long grappled with the place of the queer subject in the post-apartheid moment, I find the concept deeply compelling, and I hope to hear more about it today. As Jordache argues, right, the logics of Afro-normativity are themselves vestiges of colonial and apartheid, invested in a particular kind of heteronormative imaginary of the African body. Yet by centering difference as, I quote, an urgent call to rethink the political and what constitutes the political, close quote, he offers us an expanded terrain from which new possibilities for South Africa can emerge to think more deeply about the relationship between race and place. In his pursuit of a radical decolonial politics of rationality, his words, not mine, Jordache turns to aesthetics as a way of cultivating what he calls a desire for the otherwise, a term I've used myself, whether through family photographs such as those of his grandmother or through broader cultural archives. He invites us to think seriously about what it means to continuously make and unmake race. By invoking the notion of blackening within the larger context of colonial apartheid space making, Indenture Aesthetics reactivates Steve Biko's concept of black consciousness, reminding us that being black is not a matter of pigmentation, but a reflection of a mental attitude. I invoke Biko deliberately today. As many of you know, next week marks the anniversary of June 16 uprising, when black students took on the streets in protest against Bantu education. It's 50 years now. Those protests were fueled in no small part by political consciousness nurtured through the Black Consciousness Movement and the South African Students' Organization. Their legacy reminds us of the enduring power of critical thought, collective imagination, and political solidarity. It is therefore fitting that we welcome Jordache here today to reconnect us with that intellectual and political tradition and to make visible the entanglements that continue to shape our present, as he reminds us, the entanglements that occurred between Indianness, Asianness, Blackness, and indigeneity during the era of slavery in the Cape unsettle contemporary categories of race in South Africa, as rooted through the Atlantic world and sedimented by the colonial apartheid state. It is in this spirit of unsettling and questioning and reimagining that we gather here today. The floor is yours, Jordache.
The title of my talk is Indentureship, Afro-Indian Aesthetics, and the Queer Archive of Race. Um, okay, I'm going to start. so, so the positionality of the South African Indian within the archive of race, particularly genealogies of Blackness, remains slippery and elusive. What do we really know about the Indian, especially in relationship to Blackness and the making of race within the Indian Ocean world? What is Indian about the South African Indian? What is Black about the Indian? And what work does the racial identitarian category Indian do in post-apartheid South Africa? My response is that we know very little, and that what we do know has been largely informed by colonial modes of knowledge production that locks the categories Indian and Black into frameworks that limit our understanding of the making of race and processes of racialization in South Africa. This is a provocative statement to make, but I make this provocation as an invitation for us to think deeply about the afterlife of race and racial categories in the country. I make this statement whilst also recognizing that within the South African Academy and beyond, the Indian has been a subject of much analysis, predominantly within the discipline of history, and to a larger extent across anthropology, sociology, literary studies, and the visual and performing arts. Three major themes animate the study of the Indian after 1994. First, Indian participation in the anti-apartheid struggle and Afro-Indian intimacies forged within the political domain. Second, there's been a preoccupation with the figure of Gandhi, and it's also important to note the proliferation of scholarship on Gandhi after 1994. And third, Indian desires for belonging to the nation, or what the literary scholar Pallavi Rastogi refers to as the intense longing for belonging. Some may even argue that the Indian is overrepresented within the political and social domains in South Africa. I recognize that this scholarship has fueled my own thinking on this topic. However, I contend that what we know about the Indian has been largely shaped by colonial modes of knowledge production that fails to adequately understand the category of the Indian as it has been shaped within the crucible of colonial apartheid. For me, our collective inability to really grapple with the category of the Indian reflects a much larger issue as it relates to the overrepresentation of the Indian through the trope of the passenger Indian or the merchant class. Within the South African imaginary, all Indians, irrespective of whether they descend from the indenture or trader class, are homogenized into one group as belonging to that of the trader class, a colonial middleman class. This recurring trope has rendered indentureship and its afterlives irrelevant and has also foreclosed a critical understanding of the intimate relationship between labor, indentureship, and racialization. My research puts pressure on the category of the Indian, and my intention is to unravel this racial identitarian category. So, in my work, I propose that indentureship offers an alternative framework to understand the making of race and genealogies of Blackness within the Indian Ocean world. In other words, for a long time, I have been invested in reframing the relationship between indentureship and Blackness, investigating what indentureship reveals or could reveal about the multiple contours of South African Blackness. Can indentureship provide an alternative framework, an alternative lexicon to work through the deep history of entanglements between Black African and Afro-Indian communities? What would it mean to understand indentureship as deeply embedded within South African Blackness? How has the very project of race making in South Africa foreclosed this possibility? My work does not seek an origin narrative. It resists linear forms of thinking and challenges coherence and wholeness. Rather, I begin by recognizing that the language, frameworks, and archives, as well as our reading practices, which we have inherited from colonial apartheid, are insufficient. They fail to adequately understand race and racialization. For me, as I hope to show, Indianness and Blackness are deeply interconnected across time and space. However, the very modes of governmentality and the management of race in South Africa, from the colonial apartheid era to neoliberal forms of governance, have obscured the deep intimacies between Afro-Indian and Black African communities, whilst relying on the visual regimes of colonial apartheid modernity to structure what we see, how we see, and how we are seen across racial groups. So, wrestling with the archive of the Indian in South Africa, while seeking to understand my own experience of Indianness, which was not the hegemonic Indian experience, my desire to understand this category outside of the trader class Indian, the urban Indian, and the heteronormative Indian took me on a journey across rural and township spaces, to the sugarcane plantations along the Indian Ocean in KwaZulu-Natal, to Utongati, a small rural coastal village often referred to as the last bastion of Indian indentureship in South Africa, and to the Natal Midlands, where the afterlife of indentureship activates the body and the senses in ways that, for me, trouble our very ideas of race. I sought out family archives and delved into the making of the home space in the afterlife of colonial indentureship as an archive itself. My journey outward was a journey inward, one where it became necessary for me to grapple with my own body as an archive. This rural, urban, local, global, queer femme body marked as Indian, formed out of the history of indentureship and race making in South Africa. A body, I realized, that was gesturing outwards, desiring differently, resisting capture within the visual regime of colonial apartheid modernity. My body became a questioning body. To echo Frantz Fanon from Black Skin, White Masks, I was guided by the following sentence: "Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions." So today's talk is going to unfold in three movements. Movement one, Indenture Aesthetics, Race and Relationality. Movement two, African Queer Aesthetic Forms, Creative Research and Knowledge Production. And movement three, Indentureship, Vulnerability and Blackening. Movement one, As my research developed, I became interested in exploring whether indentureship could provide an alternative language to understand Indianness, or what I refer to as Afro-Indianness, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, in relationship to South African Blackness. Attentive to class, it became important to separate the indenture Indian from the passenger Indian, recognizing that the racialization of the indenture class was significantly different than the racialization of the trader class Indian, and that the emplacement of the indenture class was also different than the trader class Indian. As I began to unravel the category of the Indian by troubling Indian normativity as it attaches to the figure of the passenger Indian, it became necessary to also grapple with the ways in which Blackness in post apartheid South Africa has morphed into a signifier of the authentic national subject. He who truly belongs to, and he who is entitled to enjoy the land. For me, it was impossible to separate Indianness from Blackness. To really understand the shifting contours of South African Blackness, it was important to engage with the afterlife of Black consciousness, whilst recognizing that the Blackness of the Black elite, the Mandelas, the Zumas, the Ramaphosas, is not the same as the Blackness of the majority population who continue to live in the afterlife of colonial apartheid. Once again, I found that our language fails to understand some of these complex contradictions. The ANC's explicit positioning as a non-racial organization complicates claims to South African Black nationalism. Within this context, I coined the term Afro-normativity. I coined the term Afro-normativity to understand how new formations of race in neoliberal South Africa intersect with normative notions of class, gender, and sexuality to separate the authentic Black subject from the new Black and Blackened others. Afro-normativity illuminates the mechanisms through which exclusive forms of Black nationalism are performed, engaged, and discussed by folk who often claim non-racialism and inclusive forms of post-apartheid belonging. Afro-normativity creates an outsider positionality that includes Black women and LGBTIQ plus folk, as well as Indians, coloreds, immigrants, the working class and working poor, and those at the intersections. Afro-normativity's emphasis on authenticity routed through nativism and class, gender, sexual normativity creates a context that forecloses the ability to organize across difference, to grapple with our interconnected past, presents, and futures. So if Afro-normativity names racial normativities, Indenture Aesthetics, informed by queer of color critique and Black feminisms, queers those regimes of racial normativity. Indenture Aesthetics displaces the normative racial subject across the categories Black and Indian to reveal the practices of livability from the margins, from the positionalities of those who are excluded from the domain of Black authenticity. Whereas Black authenticity manages difference through its violent abjection, Indenture Aesthetics prioritizes difference as a method to examine our interconnected pasts, presents, and futures, prioritizing what I refer to as non-statist forms of relationality. Reactivating Biko's Black consciousness through the aesthetic practices of Black and Afro-Indian women and LGBTIQ plus artists, or what I refer to as a radical African queer imaginary, my research explores what an ethical politics of relationality could look like in post-apartheid South Africa when difference is at the center of the frame and not relegated to the margins. How do we imagine coalitional building and solidarity in the afterlife of Black consciousness and colonial apartheid if the very function of Afro-normativity and its neoliberal foundations is to discipline bodies through authenticity and nativism? So in my book, I understand Afro-normativity as emerging from the vestiges of colonial apartheid and is a result of neoliberal economic policies that continue to separate those whose lives matter from those rendered disposable and expendable. Let me be clear. I turn to indentureship not to rewrite indenture history. I think that's been overdone. I am interested in understanding indentureship as a point of connection, what I conceptualize as a hinge. As a hinge, indentureship allows me to engage with the long history of coercive labor practices and their entanglements in the Indian Ocean world of Southern Africa. From the era of slavery in the Cape, forms of African and indigenous indentureship, the introduction of Indian indentured workers in Natal in 1860, as well as the history of African migrant labor schemes that continue to displace large populations of Africans across Southern Africa. By understanding the specificity of coercive labor regimes in Southern Africa, it became apparent that Atlantic frameworks of race and racialization could not adequately capture what was happening in this context. And so in the book, one of the things I'm arguing is that the blackness of the Black Atlantic is not the blackness of the Indian Ocean world, and that the South Asian of North America is not the Afro-Indian of Southern Africa. Indian Ocean Studies scholars like Isabel Hofmeyr, Harshini Bana Young, Gabebe Badaroon, for instance, have long been at the forefront of this research, teaching us that the entangled histories of slavery and indentureship trouble what we think we know about race and racial categories in South Africa. These longer histories of coercive labor practices in the Indian Ocean world necessitate different frameworks, analytics, and methodologies. Furthermore, these longer histories have been strategically excluded from the making of the post-apartheid nation. They begin to challenge normative racial formations and the linear and progress narrative and the time-space of the post-apartheid nation. These longer histories reveal ruptures that create alternative pathways to imagining otherwise. In a society that overemphasizes the visuality of race, my research explores how visual culture and performance art practices could possibly confound and challenge our collective imaginaries of race and racial difference. In my monograph, Indenture Aesthetics, I begin with an analysis of Reshma Chiba's self-portrait, I Am Kali, I Am Black. As the title suggests, this is also a portrait of the Indian goddess Kali. In this image, Chiba troubles the racial identitarian categories Black and Indian and writes, Kali is black in her Indianness, is Indian in her blackness, and black in her Indianness. Through the aesthetic, the artist troubles the boundaries between Black and Indian, and by evoking the Indianness of Blackness and the Blackness of Indianness, she cites Steve Biko's Black consciousness. In this image, curated as part of a project, The Two Talking Yonis, Chiba offers a provocative critique of authentic Blackness and uses the Indian goddess Kali to loosen Blackness as a signifier of nativism and heteronormativity. Kali is an Indian goddess associated with abjection and decay, the burial grounds and sexual erotic excess. Kali destabilizes the cosmos and is linked to both death and rebirth. As a representation of deviant feminine energy, Kali disrupts the boundaries between life and death, masculine and feminine, Indian and Black, respectable and transgressive, sacred and profane. Chiba's use of transgressive femininity through the figure of Kali allowed me to think and feel through other artists' engagement with femininity, vulnerability, and feminist, as fecund sites to trouble the normative parameters of race, particularly Blackness and Indianness. And as this slide shows, I have a big interest in male femininity. So I want to bring together three of the main arguments that animated my research and which culminate in the book. First, I argue that indentureship was a form of blackening, and I will talk about blackening in Movement 3, that is unaccounted for within our conceptualizations of race and racialization in South Africa. So, as a hinge, I argue that indentureship illuminates overlapping regimes of racialized labor across time and space. In my work, I also unhinge indentureship from its racialization as Indian and show how in the Indian Ocean world this logic doesn't hold. Finally, I argue that the aesthetic, visual culture, and performance art can reveal the deep and significant intimacies between Afro-Indianness, Blackness, and Africanness, intimacies that have for a long time been foreclosed. Throughout this book, I turn to visual culture and performance art practices to trace lines of embodied desire between Afro-Indian and Black African communities. As a hinge, indentureship functions as both method and aesthetic that illuminates our entangled past, presents, and futures. So, this book is in conversation with three important African intellectuals that I would like to highlight. Number one, Fatima Meer's commitment to vulnerability and her astute understanding of the difference between the indenture class Indian and the trader class Indian, as articulated in her book Portrait of Indian South Africans, has been very influential on my conceptualization of what I refer to as indentured vulnerability. Through her sociological research and her ethnographic methodologies, Meer articulated a framework to think through Afro Indian intimacies after the 1949 race riots that prioritize vulnerability as a site of coalitional building. Second, as is apparent, Steve Biko's Black consciousness. And third, Kagero Macheria's queer conceptualization of Rabin in his book Frottage. Given the critiques of Black consciousness in relationship to its gender, sexual, class politics, I route Black consciousness through a radical African queer imaginary. In other words, indenture aesthetics queers Black consciousness. Methodologically, I'm interested in what happens. How do we begin to see, to feel, to sense, to touch differently when aesthetic forms created by Afro Indian and Black African artists rub against each other? Each chapter of the book engages a Black African artist in relation to an Afro Indian artist. In the book, I read for Afro Indian intimacies within specific artworks, like Shiva's portrait, I Am Kali, I Am Black, Charlene Khan's needlepoint lace image, Strange Fruit, or my own creative project, Queering the Archive, as well as across artworks. I am interested in how Rabin erodes racial authenticity and the heteronormative imaginaries of race and belonging in South Africa. Rabin allows me to engage the body, the libidinal, the erotic, and the excess. Rabin queers the racial hierarchy and allows us to feel, to sense, to touch where Afro-Indianness and Black Africanness bleed into each other and or slide off each other. What does Rabin reveal about the intense longing for intimacy between Black African and Afro-Indian communities? If Afronormativity manages Black authenticity and results in the violent abjection of difference in relationship to class, gender, race, and sexual difference, indenture aesthetics articulates a relational framework that reorganizes how we think about intimacy and belonging outside of blood kinship models, genealogical trees, and the nation. Movement 2, African queer aesthetic forms, creative research, and knowledge production. So my engagement with sexuality and queerness emerged through my own creative art practice. And I want to reflect on the importance of creative research or research creation and knowledge production in post-apartheid South Africa. My foundational training occurred within the Wits School of the Arts. I entered Wits University in the late 90s and early 2000s when there was much shift occurring within the South African higher education landscape. My journey into an art school was wayward and defiant. I challenged the expectation that I would become a doctor. I arrived in Johannesburg in 1999 to study medicine. On the sidelines of debates occurring within the higher education sector and grappling with an apartheid era education, my arrival in Johannesburg revealed to me in very stark terms the artificiality of the racialized worlds we lived in, of which the schooling system was part of. After reading Fanon in a class, my interest in knowledge production and what constitutes proper knowledge production developed. And as I reached critical consciousness, I became suspicious of forms of knowledge production that reproduce the very binaries and hierarchies of colonial logics. As someone invested in the visual and the aesthetic, I turned to art making and curation as methods to wrestle with the afterlife of colonial visuality. I was troubled by the stark racialized division of scholarship within the South African Academy, and a lot of people have pointed this out, particularly in relationship to Black African and Afro-Indian communities. Many of the traditional disciplines did not appeal to me, and the notion of scholarly objectivity further abstracted me from my body, my history, and my experience, and for me didn't provide ways to imagine outside of inherited categories and proper objects of analysis. I wanted to prioritize the feeling and the body. I wanted to feel history, feel difference, feel race, feel the other. My body was gesturing towards a different way of relating to history, archives, and experiences, and this journey allowed me to understand the importance of creative research as an alternative form of knowledge production. Through creative research, I was invested in activating what Cherie Moraga calls a theory in the flesh, one that understands the body as an archive of history. This activated my quest to understand the blackened body in the afterlife of colonial indenture apartheid as informed by overlapping histories of corporeal dislocation. Research creation allowed me to grapple with and to work through the otherwise. It allowed me to understand the body as willingly porous and permeable, questioning, and always in the process of becoming, to evoke Stuart Hall. In 2011, my short film Kane was screened at the Durban International Film Festival and the Wits Arts and Literature Experience Festival. The film is about 15 minutes and it explores routes of migration from the sugarcane fields of KwaZulu-Natal to Fordsburg, from the Indian subcontinent to Johannesburg, through two queer or non-normative figures marked as Indian within the racial landscape of South Africa. The film was also set against the xenophobic attacks of 2008. The reception was mixed. People remarked at a screening in Johannesburg that the film failed because it did not engage politics in a protest or activist tradition, and my labeling of the film as political was misleading. And every time I think about it, I still smile. What it revealed to me is an abstraction of the political from the body, from sensation, and from the libidinal. The film was not conceptualized as a documentary, but rather focuses on the sensuality of space and time, the erotics of Afro-Indian bodies, and the affective and haptic parameters of history and memory. In 2011, I embarked on a new project using family photographs from my family archive called Queering the Archive: Brown Bodies in Ecstasy. This project reimagines the family album as a site of queer possibilities, illuminating often unseeable forms of male-male intimacies in old family photos. Using digital technologies to create visual assemblages, a queer aesthetic form, the project deliberately erodes the heteronormative and racialized parameters of family, often reinforced by the family photo album. Through this technique of queering the archive, I reimagine lines of relationality, lines of desire between differently racialized men by shifting the use of the family archive from a documentary tradition to an archive of feeling, resituating the family archive as an archive of desire and pleasure. In my practice, indentureship informs my queer aesthetics to reveal the entanglements between differently racialized bodies. And if you look at this, oops, sorry, this image, like, so you, um, it's a bit faded, but you'll see like I've included the Indian past documents. These are actually indenture numbers overlaid across the bodies. So in this project, I invite the viewer to feel, touch, and sense history otherwise. In another related project titled The Brown Photo Album, an archive of feminist futurity, which is actually the essay that Luando mentioned that was published in Kronos, echoing Santu Mofokeng's project, The Black Photo Album, I curate my mother's archive of studio photos from the 1950s to the late 1960s and ask, how do we read the photo archive of an Indian woman born in the early 1940s to parents who were wards of the colonial state? A woman who was one generation removed from the sugarcane plantations and coal mines where Indians were indentured as a coercive labor force. By focusing on the labor of performance and beauty and attentive to repetition and the body, I situate this as an archive of feminist futurity. So in these two overlapping projects, I show how the home space in the afterlife of colonial indenture apartheid, which I characterize as feminine and feminized, becomes a site of queer feminist possibilities. Working through the queer Afro-Indian body in my creative research allowed me to understand the queer positionality of the Indian within South African society and within the archive of race. It is undeniable that within South African scholarship, the Indian has been strategically imagined and recuperated as straight or heteronormative. Committed to a transgressive politics, a politics of disrespect, I set out to trouble the straight lines of history through which bodies are rendered legible. The structures of indentureship and colonialism, the journey across the Kalapani, and the attempt to insert the Indian into an already well established racial hierarchy in colonial Natal revealed for me the non normative positionality of the Indian. My research question began to expand, to really grapple with an understanding of how the Indian figures within the archive of race in South Africa. It became an urgent project to queer the ways we see and feel history and experiences, to unhinge the Indian and our collective imaginaries of race from the normative, and to challenge our deadly desires for respectability that inform regimes of belonging. So during a discussion after the screening of Cain, a group of attendees were upset when Gandhi's sexuality was raised. And so Cain was released at the same time that a book came out that kind of prodded into a relationship that Gandhi had with someone. It revealed in very dangerous ways how respectability politics functions to surveil the boundaries of race, gender, and sexuality. Early in my academic career, I learned to distrust frameworks and analytics invested in respectability and the fetishization of iconic figures like Gandhi, for instance. Post colonial Black and African feminist and queer studies scholars have long argued that respectability politics and homonormativity uphold rather than subvert systems of power and domination, rendering LGBTIQ plus folk as well as other racialized folk more vulnerable to forms of state and community sanctioned violence. Challenging our desires for the respectable and the normative, my research demonstrates a commitment to messiness, deviance, and transgression, to articulations of femininity and feminist, violation and vulnerability that are indicative of strategies of survival and practices of imagining otherwise, which can only emerge when we collectively gestate in the ruins of empire, the ruins of colonial apartheid, the ruins of history. I invite the reader and the audience to adopt a queer gaze, to queer the ways in which we are conditioned to see and know across our regimes of racialized difference. To see queerly requires us to decenter the urban, to trouble the black-white binary, and to reorganize our understanding of blackness, Africanness, and Indianness. To see queerly is to deliberately disrupt the colonial order of things, to mess things up, to create absolute disorder. A queer gaze recenters the body, the libidinal, the erotic, and the abject. eroding our collective and deadly desires for normativity, for belonging, for continuity, for linearity. To echo Kathy Cohen in relationship to Simon and Corley, queerness is an invitation to abdicate our desires for normativity and mastery, one that invites us to reorganize our relationship to power and to willingly disrupt our investments in narrow identitarian politics. What would it mean to understand queerness as an invitation to step outside of nation time, outside of Afro-normativity and its deadly logics? One that recognizes how the afterlife of the colonial apartheid racial hierarchy continues to invisibilize our interconnected pasts, presents, and futures. A queer gaze invites us to reach outwards, to feel for, to feel with, to feel alongside our differences. A queer gaze directs us to the world of those who exist on the margins, violently excluded from the domain of authentic blackness, those whom I refer to as the new black and blackened others of the post apartheid state. Building on my conceptualization of indentureship as a hinge and the queerness of the South African Indian within the structures of the colonial apartheid racial hierarchy, I turned to the visual archive of the indentured Indian to understand the relationship between indentureship, queerness, and femininity. In 1950, the colonial apartheid state published a composite image of indentured male workers in Meet the Indian in South Africa. This image has been reproduced in numerous studies on the South African Indian. For example, Dupelia Mestri's book From Cane Fields to Freedom, Riasan Naidu's exhibition catalog, The Indian in Drum in the 1950s, as well as my own book and articles. In most publications, the image appears early on and is used to narrate a story about Indianness where the history of violence and violation, indenture history, is mapped onto a progress narrative, a linear narrative of economic success and social mobility. Inevitably, such linear narratives fold the indenture class into the trope of the passenger Indian, foreclosing any critical understanding of indentureship and its afterlives in South Africa. When I look at this image, I am drawn to the emaciated bodies of the indentured male photographed in colonial Natal after the journey across the Kalapani. The sunken eyes, protruding rib cages, and the body in a state of deterioration suggests for me that this is an image of violence and violation. The indenture numbers and the ID style photos insert these bodies into the governmentality of the colonial state. Importantly, when we look at this composite image, the erasure of the indentured woman is obvious. When I inquired after this at the Gandhi Lutuli archives at UKZN, I was told that all originals had been lost and that the best place to look for such images, particularly of indentured women, would be in family photo albums. This took me on a journey to seek out the photo of the indentured woman. So, working with my mother, we located a family photo of my mother's grandmother, a woman who was 22 years old when she, her husband, and their 2-year-old baby were indentured to a coal mine outside of Ladysmith. When I located this image, I was drawn to the blackened face of the older woman seated in the middle of the frame. This dark, ghostly figure, the gritty, non normative, disabled femininity which emerged out of the death worlds of labor, tell us something about indentureship and the making of race that categories like Indian and Black are unable to account for. Her face captures my notion of blackening that emerges out of the death worlds of labor and capital. In the book, I seek to understand indentureship and its afterlives as a form of feminization that situates Afro-Indianness as always already queer. I weave indentureship and its afterlives into a broader understanding of South African history that stretches from the era of slavery in the Cape to the violence of colonial apartheid labor regimes, including African migrant labor schemes, to the post-apartheid context characterized by significantly deadly levels of gender-based violence that disproportionately affects Black women and queer and trans folk. South African Black feminists like Pumla Ola, for instance, argue that this history of violence and violation stitches together South Africa's past, present, and future. I contend that these overlapping histories of violence and violation also confound racial categories. They reveal forms of intimacies created within the death worlds of labor that untangle race from the normative. Through different manifestations of femininity, feminist, and feminization, routed through scenes of vulnerability and violation, as well as articulations of gender sexual excess, deviance, and transgression, I seek to understand forms of intimacies and entanglements between the new Black and Blackened others, those who are systematically excluded from heteronativist parameters of post apartheid Blackness. Blackening evokes the entangled world of coercive labor practices that disrupt the time space of the post apartheid nation. Blackening queers a normative blackness, or what I refer to as Afro-normativity. To be blackened is to be rendered abject and excess, to exist outside nation time, to be erased from history. Blackening suggests that Black freedom has been curtailed by neoliberal economic policies, and that Black as a category in South Africa, as it emerges out of Black consciousness, can no longer account for the world of the majority Black population. So, for instance, in Khan's project, When the Moon Waxes Red, the journey through the death world of indentureship and its afterlives is a form of blackening that aesthetically engages the sugarcane plantations as well as scenes of gendered violence and death. In Faga's aesthetic practice, blackening emerges as an aesthetic of bodily excess and waste, sweat, semen, feces, through which the artists explore their violent expulsion from normative blackness. Moho Modisikhen engages blackening as a reference to the death worlds of the coal mines and the queer femme figure of the migrant labor who exists outside nation time. Modisikhen also engages an aesthetic of male femininity, emphasizing the vulnerability of the blackened body in the afterlife of colonial apartheid. Through my research, I am invested in articulating a politic of feeling. My desire is to feel history, feel difference, feel race, feel the other, gesturing towards a different way, counterintuitive methods of relating to archives, theories, and experience. I am committed to a collective yearning for a new world order, imagining and articulating ways of being and being together across difference. So, the artists examined in my book From Faga to Khan are engaged in creating and imagining new forms of relationalities, pushing against the unfreedoms of the post apartheid, demonstrating the urgency of designing non statist forms of relationality within the context of Afro-normativity. Our desire for freedom must shift to a hunger for the otherwise as a quotidian and embodied praxis of survival. Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions. Thank you.
I'm sure all of you need a bit of time to digest all of that, because even for me, and I've been reading your work, and also there are some overlaps in our work. There were a lot of concepts that were new to me. A lot of beautiful ways that you've articulated this narrative of a queer aesthetics that is defiant and deviant and contends with normativity, particularly, how do you put it, the heteropatriarchal nation, Afro-nationhood, or how did you, Afro-normativity, that's right. But also troubling notions of very sort of staid and narrow racial politics. But what I want to do is, because you really went through that quite quickly, I want to go into this idea of the Afro-normative. And if you could speak to that a little bit. And what I'm really interested in is the notion of belonging. You had put up there longing and belonging, but I'm more interested in the unbelonging, the belonging to an unbelonging in a way. Because in asking for us to reach across difference in this kind of other, this blackened other, you are asking for another kind of belonging in a way, which is quite ironic in the unbelonging. So let's first talk about Afro-normativity.
I think I kind of came up with the term Afro-normativity because I just felt like Black nationalism didn't kind of capture the South African sense. And I was also very careful of just taking like terms from the global north, right? Because like you study Black studies in like the US context, like Black nationalism is a big thing. But Black nationalism functions differently in South Africa, and like the very contours of it had to shift because this is a Black majority country, and so the very dynamics are like really different, and also the ANC has always claimed a very kind of explicit non-racial identity, but there's a history to how they get to the non-racial, right? Um, and so I really was struggling with language, and also I felt like a lot of the language we have just didn't capture some of what I was trying to do in the book, and so like I started thinking through this project during the major like xenophobic attacks of 2008, and it was really interesting to me how, which is resonating today also, to think about how a very particular type of blackness was consolidating in South Africa to create the boundaries between who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that kind of blackness was also like reshaping a kind of black consciousness. And what was interesting for me is that like a lot of the artists I actually worked with in this book, whether they were Black African artists or what I call Afro-Indian artists, like came into political consciousness through Black consciousness and oftentimes referred to themselves as Black. And it was a Blackness that I understood because it was also a Blackness that kind of like captured the experiences that I had, like coming into political, racial, sexual, class consciousness. And so to me, I wanted to prod into this kind of notion of blackness because I also felt like it was disappearing in the post-apartheid period. And that there were sections of people who were still claiming a particular kind of political blackness, right? And we can talk about how political blackness rubs against cultural blackness and how they are all different and all of that. But what I was really trying to get at is how, from what I was seeing, and Zanele Moholi has done a lot of work in terms of Black, queer, and trans folk, and through aesthetics, but how there was a different kind of way for us to think about the relationship between Blackness and the nation, the relationship between South African Blackness and Blackness from the rest of the continent. And so I really just wanted to think about also like this class of the Black elite that was like consolidating around a particular kind of race, gender, sexual class politics, and how that was signifying something else. And so Afro-normativity became a way for me to think through that, but it also became a way for me to trouble Indian normativity. So Afro-normativity, like brings Blackness and Indianness together and says that, if we really want to understand South African society, we have to displace the normative. We have to move away from kind of like frameworks and ways of thinking about society that always privilege certain kinds of figures and always privilege certain kinds of experiences. And to me, like growing up in KwaZulu-Natal, I grew up in rural KwaZulu-Natal, like in Utongati. My experiences of Indianness were not the urban experience. Like the way we understand our relationship to Indianness as rural people, like we are farm people, is very different than, like, I grew up in the sugarcane plantations, right? And this seeps into my work, right? Like, the space for me is so important. It has informed everything I do. It informs the way I think. It informs the way I even think about queerness, right? Um, and so I wanted to capture a sense of those dynamics, and I needed language to do it. And I think it's about time we started creating new language, because I think the language we have is kind of fatigued. And so I think that's the job for those that come after us also, is we need new frameworks, we need new methods, we need new ways of, like, thinking through these questions, because these are questions that are going to arise again and again, because we haven't resolved them. The question of race in South Africa is not resolved. The question of who is Indian and who is colored and who is black is not resolved. Although we kind of buy into these ideas that it may have been, but I think we constantly need to trouble them. And so that's where I was trying to get at. And I was trying to think about how, we really go back to the deep and long history of coercive labor practices in Southern Africa that goes back to the era of slavery. It kind of really starts to confound our racial categories, right? Even though, one of the things I do critique in the book is how in South African scholarship, we've adopted a lot of the Atlantic frameworks to think about race. But there is the Indian Ocean scholars who keep troubling this and keep teaching us that, the history of race making in South Africa is totally different. And so I really was trying to think about, like, and like, one of the things I do in the book is I do actually make a big critique of the nation. I do say at one point of the book is that we have to abdicate our desires for the nation, because the nation is going to ensure that it kills us, right? The nation is a necropolitical formation. The nation just doesn't just manage race, gender, and sexuality. It also ensures our death. And so one of the things that, and I say this also recognizing, that the South African nation, went to the court, like, protested against the genocide in Gaza and all of that. But I'm trying to make a larger critique of the nation, like, and how, we haven't moved away from different forms of belonging. So I think one of the things I'm trying to think about is not just different forms of belonging or unbelonging, which becomes a different form of belonging, which I really love, but also different forms of sociality. Like, what does it mean to think about society outside of the nation, right? Because, and I don't think we can actually imagine that. But I want to provoke us to start thinking about that. Like, what would it mean for us to relate to each other, not based on the frameworks and the kind of, like, like, of what the nation kind of, like, prioritizes, but what are the other ways in which we can relate to each other that kind of, like, ask us to, like, like, to think about the nation in more critical ways, to think about to disrupt the nation and our kind of deadly desires for belonging. So, like, this also emerges out of my own experiences of queerness. I never felt like I wanted to belong to any queer formation, because I always felt that within every structure of belonging is embedded structures of violence and structures of surveillance. And so belonging, I really wanted to think outside of these normative ways of belonging, and to think about what happens to how how do we create forms of relationality that kind of, like, challenge these kinds of ideas of belonging and ideas of nation.
Thank you. On that note of Afro-normativity, I want to go on to your next concept of the Afro-Indian. In trying to sort of dismantle all of these identity politics, if you will, here comes another term, the Afro-Indian, and I'm really interested in how you've come to conceptualize that term.
Thank you for that. So, as is apparent through the talk, I'm very suspicious of the category of the Indian as it has been consolidated in South Africa. And And one of the things that I've been thinking through is how within a collective South African imaginary, how the Indian functions and how the Indian appears, right? And, it became very apparent to me, like, through my movements from, like, rural KwaZulu-Natal to Johannesburg and then to the US and then to Canada, is that this category of the Indian was actually, how do I explain it? It didn't capture not just multiple Indian experiences, but but it is shaped in such a way that it always positions the Indian as alien other. And I wanted to trouble that. And going to North America revealed to me why I needed to trouble that. Because when people looked at me in New York City or in certain spaces, like in New York City, you get mixed up for a lot of things. But like in certain spaces, and then in Canada, right? Like it shifted from Indian then to being described as South Asian. And I was like, no, I am not South Asian. Like you people who came to the global north were strategically brought here for your technical skills. Y'all are a professional class. We were indentured workers. We worked on sugarcane plantations. And so the category of the South Asian erases that kind of difference. And it's also just very lazy, right? And so we get captured into this kind of category of the South Asian. And that made me think about how we get captured into this category of the Indian in South Africa. And so I'm very clear in the book that I'm not like my category of the South Asia, the Afro-Indian is not to reproduce more categories. I'm very suspicious of the reproduction of more categories. But I want to actually see it as a site of disorientation and reorientation. I want to reorient the Indian to Africa and to Africanness, right? I want to kind of capture a way of thinking about Indianness as formed out of the African soil, right? And not as something that's always alien. And I think, like, and I think so the notion of Afro-Indian for me was important because it started troubling this category of the Indian, particularly as I saw it manifesting and circulating in popular culture and in other kind of cultural forms. And I was like, no, there's something, we have to trouble this category. Just as we trouble Blackness, we have to trouble Indianness. And that's how I started getting to the Afro-Indian. And, like in the book, for instance, and you'll see in a lot of my artwork, like, so I have a project called the Brown Photo Album. Then I have a lot of art pieces that have brown in the titles. And as I was working on this book, like brownness didn't kind of do, it became insufficient in itself. It wasn't allowing me to think through what it would mean to think through an African Indianness. And then also like brownness was being incorporated, like Latinx studies, the term brown circulates a lot. But there was also a new generation of South Asian scholars who are starting to use the term brown. And what I was very afraid of is how their terminology of brownness was consolidating in a way that must abject Blackness. And I was like, no, brown does not do the work I want to do. But Afro-Indianness, I think, does it. I don't know. You can be the yeah. So that's how I got to Afro-Indianness. But also it was important for me, as you would have heard in the talk, like it became very important for me to separate the indenture class from the trader class. And to say it, we are not the same. Our histories, our experiences, our forms of racialization are not the same. And so I think like Afro-Indianness started allowing me to be more kind of expansive and to stretch that category and to see what would happen with it. Yeah, and so that's how I started thinking about that.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Um, I mean, I think we would continue to grapple with these terms and terminologies, and but it is interesting to me that you are very clear about who the Afro-Indian is in some ways, that, you are departing from this idea of a homogenous Indian group, and that the Afro-Indian uh, descends or is formulated from this afterlife of indenture. Okay, so I've got that right. So
But
so
can I just say
yeah, yeah,
something to that?
please.
Because I get asked a lot, right? Like, oh, you evoke Fatima Mir, Reshma Chiba is actually from the trader class. Um, but for me, it like indenture aesthetics is not indenture history, right? And for me, I when I go back and read Fatima Mir's work, I'm like, you're an Afro-Indian, right? And when I read Reshma Chiba's work and her artwork and what she's doing, and the disavowal of a kind of normative politics, that's what creates the Afro-Indian. It's the Afro-Indian that's disavowing a kind of hegemonic Indianness, the trader class Indian, and those kinds of tropes, right? Because it's the trope that functions within the imaginary. Um, and so I'm very clear that this is the indenture aesthetics is not indenture history. The aesthetic allows us to kind of make that leap in my work.
Thank you. So would you say it's then a departure from the respectable Indian? Yes. um, yeah, okay. So very much based on the transgressive, the deviant, the defiant. Um, I would like to also for you to speak a little bit more about this blackening, because you use it, you seem to use it, one, in kind of like how systems have blackened bodies, but then you also kind of take it back in your work, and you look at this blackening as this kind of transgressive, deviant um, way of, sort of disrupting.
And so, blackening became a way for me to think about the racial hierarchy, right? And how we've inherited this racial hierarchy, but how the racial hierarchy, always positions some people like lower on that hierarchy and others higher on that hierarchy. It became a way for me to think about like the entanglement of coercive labor practices, right? And even though, we can go back to the history of slavery in the Cape, with a lot of scholars have done this work that shows that in the initial years of slavery, a lot of the people who were enslaved were actually from South Asia, and then it started shifting in the later years. And so, like I needed some language to start thinking about like what happens when we start thinking about and in the North American world you have like the category black, which emerges through the transatlantic slave trade. So slavery is always connected to some sort of blackness. Um, but we don't have that same kind of logic here, the way in which race functions in South Africa. So blackening became a way for me to think about a kind of queering of the nation, a kind of queering of Afro-normativity, a way to think about those who are excluded from the domain of the normative, those who exist on the outsides of society, those who exist on the peripheries of society, and to deal with that. And to me, like blackening is related to labor, right? And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to capture in this book is that indentureship was a form of racialization, right? Labor is a form of racialization. You get racialized through labor practices, right? From African migrant labor schemes to the indentured world, slavery, and even current forms of labor that continuously racializes. And so it allowed me to think about a way to encapsulate that difference, right? But to also encapsulate something that almost like sticks people together, right? Even though we don't want to recognize we are stuck, right? Like blackening became a way because to me blackening is gritty, right? And then I read it through the artworks. It's gritty, it's sweaty, it's semen, it's feces, it's all of these excess and abject kind of like bodily practices that allow us to think about how we relate to each other across our differences. Like a lot of people ask me about caste, so I'm just going to put it out there. I don't have much to say about caste, except that if I had the luxury of more time, I could have thought about caste and blackening. But as someone who's, like, I think there's more work that needs to be done on caste in South Africa, in relationship to, like the Afro-Indian communities. Um, but yeah, I, I don't know, like, yeah, I think that's how I would respond to black.
I'm trying to look for the section where you talk about, you have a beautiful way of speaking about temporality and about how the conditions of slavery, and I don't want to misread you, but the conditions of slavery led to this kind of continuity of this coercive labor system. And I know that you're quite diligent about not conflating the two, but it is this kind of exploitative nature of slavery that kind of led to indenture, that kind of colors it in a way, and now still persists within in our present within sort of mining and migration and what we now call foreign nationals, and now with this, this, I guess they would also be this blackened other. Do you want to say more about that? I don't,
Uh,
yeah, just about the temporality and, yeah, and these systems of coercive labor.
Yes, so perhaps before Jordache answers that question, we might want to, in terms of thinking about time, maybe open it up a little bit to the floor.
Did you transit through Mauritius in these journeys? Because I mean, I was thinking through all of these at the prism of what Mauritius is, which is, I mean, at the heart of the Indian Ocean in many ways. I've had the luck of spending some time there and engaging with people, etc., etc. And it's a society that is entirely shaped by indenture. Um, However, it didn't lead to much political queerness at all. You have, in fact, sodomy has been abolished as a crime in 2023 in October. So it's like, I mean, that was at the time when I was there, actually. So one of the last, probably, I mean, we still have quite a few in Africa, but, and then you have this whole kind of uh, political, racial setup where, in fact, you have the so-called Creole population that is sort of speaks of a Creole genocide perpetrated against them, which is basically the descendants of slaves. So I was just wondering what would it be to throw that in the mix, and yeah, and and also to see like the Indian Ocean a bit more, yeah, like in its fragments with outside of the South Africa kind of India axis. Um, I also had a half question as to whether the indenture versus trader creates another binary.
Meganthri Pillay. It's so wonderful to hear things articulated that you've been grappling with and resonate with. I just want to do a quick poem that speaks to some of this. I'm a so-called Indian in a so-called new South Africa, living in the Boer Kaap, more a Muslim than a Hindu, more, excuse this, but this is what I wrote at the time, more a red Indian than a South Indian. It took a Steve Biko, though, to bring me back to my Black roots.
Afternoon. Thank you for that talk and for the lovely poem. And I think my question kind of relates to that, particularly around the idea of the Afro-Indian and its relation and how it relates to the idea of Blackness as defined by Biko. And then also, I would like for us, or this could be a general question of directed to you around thinking of ways in which we think beyond the idea of the nation and rather the different forms of sociality that you mentioned, and how you think your work specifically as specifically looking at indentureship as a method and as an aesthetic. How would that assist in that process of creating different forms of sociality beyond the nation?
I think my question is much more on your poetic method of reading Biko and rereading Biko, because I think sometimes when we read Biko, we read Fanon, we have a kind of an imprisoned way of reading that we can only read within a particular terrain. But I think you're doing a particular reading of Biko. I will use this language, reading Biko as an ancestor and as a speaking ancestor that continues to speak. And so I wanted you to speak more about that, how you continue to engage with Biko, because I find that very beautiful.
It's a bit of a half-baked question and comment, because I always remember in the chapter, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, Fanon speaks about how neoliberalism kind of creates this intense confusion, among the elite. So just to bear that in mind. So what I'm actually wanting to know is kind of maybe a broader field where your work kind of circulates, um, and given the kind of hegemony that the post-apartheid has in a way produced when it comes to ideas around Black study and what that means, and the kind of very, forgive me guys, the kind of very heteronormative, patriarchal imposition that kind of performs a hegemony, that kind of guards the gates when one wants to bring about valid critique, and for me, particularly in the reproduction and the social reproduction of patriarchy in that thinking. And we see it in very real ways, how patriarchal thought kind of groups around particular ideas, around Biko as an ancestor, as a living ancestor. I'm wondering if you do consider your work as an intervention at that table, or if we just like, I don't know, breaking that table and just making lots of other tables where we can have a coffee and a cup of tea on the coast of Asia or KwaZulu-Natal, So I'm just, the field of your work and how that work possibly intervenes in the kind of hegemony that we are exposed to at the moment and that we are experiencing in the aftermath of what we know to be Black consciousness.
In terms of Mauritius, Mauritius is interesting because it was the first place to actually get indentured workers in the, after this, after the end of slavery. So one of the things I do in the book is I take both Black studies and I actually take Black studies to task, because one of the things I argue in the book is that indentureship is the afterlife of slavery. But Black studies scholars have failed to engage indentureship. And to me, that speaks to a larger, it speaks to the colonial logics of knowledge production, and even how our archives are separated, and even how we haven't learned, or we haven't been taught or trained, I don't know what the right word is, to read across archives. And so I wanted to go and disrupt all those archives, to be like, no, you cannot talk about slavery without talking about indentureship. You cannot talk about indentureship without talking about Blackness. I firmly believe that you cannot do indenture studies without engaging Blackness, especially in Southern Africa, but also in the Caribbean, right? And so that's one of the big interventions, one of the big things that I have kind of, and I say it very clearly in the book, like, you know, Black studies scholars refuse to engage in indentureship because we are trapped within certain racialized logics. And to me, it doesn't serve any purpose. We need to break from it. In terms of Mauritius, like, I don't really know much about Mauritius, and I didn't want this book to, um, you know, to be a broad kind of Indian Ocean world study of indentureship. Because to me, the intervention was in South African Black studies, right? And it's from South African Black studies that the intervention in, like, you know, global Black studies becomes apparent. Like, Black studies scholars in the US have been very excited about the work. And that has been really interesting to me. Um, but also, I have a colleague from Mauritius who responded to my book in the Caribbean at the Caribbean Philosophical Association. And one of the things she said to me, which was very interesting, because I've never been to Mauritius, she said, like, Jordache, like, after reading your book, it like became so apparent to me that, like, indentureship looks very different in Mauritius, and Indianness looks very different in Mauritius. And so I think that's a whole different project. You know, I think there's more work to be done there, and, you know, she's doing some of that work, which is really exciting. Um, but yeah, it's you know, like I don't know, like, we could think about indentureship also comparatively with the Caribbean. I think there's so much of, like, resonances between those spaces. Um, in terms of the question around, you know, Biko as a living, speaking ancestor, you know, one of the things I wanted to do was read Biko from an Afro-Indian position in the contemporary sense, right? There's a lot of work, you know, that Ashwin Desai and they may have done around, like, you know, Biko and Black consciousness from the Durban perspective. But I also felt like we needed a generational shift from that work. Um, and so I wanted to, you know, like, I'm very influenced by Biko and Fanon. Those are texts that I go back to all the time. Um, and I wanted to read them from my positionality as a queer Afro-Indian, rural, but also, like, Durban and Biko there's a synergy there, right? Like, so much happened in Durban. And so I wanted to capture some of that, and I really wanted to route Biko through what I was seeing as, like, a kind of radical African queer imaginary. And what does that do to Biko? And what does Biko do to us? And what is Biko continuously doing to us? Like, why do we keep turning to Biko? Because we are not done with Biko, and Biko is not done with us. And so I wanted to capture that, and I'm not afraid, right? Like, someone asked me, they were like, "But Jordache, like, aren't you afraid to take on the category Black, like, as someone who is of Indian origin?" And I was like, "No, because I see myself as Black, right? And my Blackness is not the Blackness of North America, right? And this is coming out of the US. And so to me, it was important not to be afraid to assume that positionality, right? But it became a political act of saying, I am not only Black, but I'm also African. And we live in a country where we are not seen as belonging, right? The recurring trope of the Indian, right? Julius Malema wants us all to go back to India, right? Um, and, you know, like, and it's how, like, these certain ideas of otherness gets attached to this body that was formed and racialized within the soil. So I wanted to be like, no, I don't care. Like, no, I'm South African. I'm from here. I am not from there. And I'm not from there, the global north. I'm from here. And so that informs how I do research. That informs what I relate to and how I relate to objects, and to theory and to methods. So I really like your question. Thank you for that. Was there another question? Your question there. I think I see my interventions, like in African queer studies, number one. And I'm saying African queer studies first because African queer studies has not been able to account for the positionality of the Indian, right? South African queer studies is overwhelmingly white, right? And as we move out of South Africa, like there's a kind of Afro-normativity happening. And so I'm very clear that I'm very interested in prodding that and like really exploring what it means to, think through this positionality of the Indian, not only as a queer positionality, but to think through the kind of desires and pleasures and sexual politics of the Afro-Indian. But also Black studies, both, in the global North and South African Black studies, or even African studies. Because I also feel like African studies fails to engage with this question of belonging around this subject of the Indian. We have like a lot of work coming out, Mahmoud Mandani's work around East Africa and stuff like that, but there has been no real engagement with this question of indentureship in African studies also. And so, I see those engagements. And then also feminist studies. This is a book of queer studies, right? But also it's kind of South African queer studies. But also, I say that whilst also recognizing that my training is in the global North. But I'm very aware of how I navigate those kind of like spaces. And so that's where I would see, a lot of that. And, like my desire is that all South Africans read this book and teach it and like engage it. Because I wrote this book for South Africa, not for, I wrote it for tenure also, but not for the global North, right? I wrote this book for South Africa, for South African scholars, for us. This book is about, when I speak to my, friends and family, like my nieces and nephews, I'm like, I'm hoping they read the book. But I'm like, this book is about you. You'll have to read it, right? This book is not abstracted to something else. So that's where I hope the work would circulate and provide and provoke conversations and get us to think about these categories, but also to think about the politics of respectability and how the politics of respectability has kind of actually curtailed so much of what we could be doing. And that is why I'm so grateful for Faga's work, right? Because they really got me to think outside of these categories and outside of the respectable.
So I've got a question involving perhaps more your work as creative research. And I'm going to ask about the relationship of some of these concepts to form. Thinking about the sacrifice of the Afro-Asian, of the Afro-Indian to form. I'm thinking of the short story by R.R.R. Dlomo, written around 1914, I suspect, where the Afro-Indian is sacrificed to the form of the short story, where a conceit is set up. The Zulu character is wondering what's happening to this other character in the short story. And there's a mystery. And suddenly, the big reveal is that this Zulu character in the rural areas, inside his hut, has married a formerly indentured Indian woman. And the end of the story is the collapse of absolute certainties of Indianness, of Zuluness, etc., etc. And that's R.R. Dlomo. So that's entering at a very specific time in considerations of the new African and what the new African will be and whether the Afro-Indian will be part of that new African. I'm thinking also in terms of literature as such, some of the works that Isabel would be looking at, Daphne Rook's novels, Miti, Ratoons, sort of the Nadine Gordimer of KZN, but nowhere near as good. But what emerges there, if you can go through the pain of reading the novels, this will not be recorded, is that there's a looseness to categories, because it is the novels are set. They're basically colonial adventure novels, but they are set in this sugarcane, and it's all about the life cycle of the sugarcane and how the weather affects the cycles of the sugarcane and the family drama that occurs in and around that sugarcane. So it's basically the KZN version of the Blast Roman with the enduring trope of South African literature. So how then might we view the sacrifice of the Afro-Asian, Afro-Indian to form, and how did that impact your own creative research as a graduate of the Wits School of Arts? How did you engage form as somebody who had to have some of these things examined, the film being critiqued, etc., etc.? Because I deal with very different kinds of art, which are okay with rubbing. I deal with jazz. And the entry of Indian oral aesthetics into South African jazz is a very different narrative. So I'd be interested to hear about the dynamics or relationality and sociality between identity and form. Thank you.
I was kind of curious to hear how you wrestle with, I'm circling here on anti-Blackness, I'm circling here around intermural antagonisms, which is another kind of form of rubbing that is not always about, which is a kind of a difficult relationality. And the ways that we're stitching ourselves together and reading for relation sometimes falls flat. How do you grapple with that in this work? Also, particularly in aesthetic terms, how have you observed that move aesthetically in the archives also that you are working through?
Part of what I was trying to do in my own creative research is to think about a different form that encapsulates this notion of the Afro-Indian. And for me, I turned to the family album. And so in this project, for instance, it's called Queering the Archive, Brown Bodies in Ecstasy. I wanted to capture a sense of the kind of multi-layered, multi-dimensions of the Afro-Indian that I was starting to think through. And so this is, just very literally, like in terms of form, this is how I started playing with it. And I always, when people ask me about this project, I was like, this is about play. I actually was just sitting with my computer. I learned how to like Photoshop things, and I started playing with it until things started coming together in terms of like how I wanted to complicate this category of the Indian as I was seeing it circulating through discourse and through popular media. And then to really push against those boundaries meant that we had to like the aesthetic had to do something. And so I was very interested in that the relationship to the aesthetic. So like this is another one of the images. And so sugarcane is very important in my aesthetics, and also the African mask. And so one of the things I really was thinking about is like living abroad, how the African mask becomes a signifier of like an authentic Africanness, right? In a very shallow way. But I was also like very interested in queering the mask, in queer, like what does it, like, because the black queer in South Africa is often excluded from the domain of authentic Africanness. And so, I wanted to actually just play with these forms. I wanted to bring kind of what we would refer to as Indian aesthetics, right? So this is like a sari, this is the coconut and the banana. I grew up in a Christian family, so these are just like props, right? And then the whole like sexuality, the nudity, the masking and stuff like that. But it's also interesting because like there's not a lot of masking traditions in South Africa. And so, but I've seen these masks in people's houses that I went to. These masks even hang in my own house. And so, like, the form became interested. Like, I was very interested in form. And then to the question of form, it was also curation. Because as this project developed, I realized that what I had to do was to actually curate and to put together aesthetic forms and practices that were never put together in conversation. And so that became a way of me to think through. And I think it also goes to the question around like indentureship and sociality. And that became a way for me to think through like what happens with form when we start putting it together. And how do these different forms that I argue hinges on indentureship, like theoretically and methodologically in the book, like how does that then start to inaugurate, to introduce new ways of being together, whilst recognizing that difference is important, right? And so even with the aesthetics, I was trying to capture the sense of difference. So that's also one of the images where I kind of, like use this kind of aesthetic of bleeding, of like layering, to kind of disrupt the very bodily boundaries between Black and Indian, right? And so the whole project is a project that works with layers in different ways. So that's what I was trying to do. And then in terms of like failure, and I want to add some other terms to that: failure, bottomhood, vulnerability, femininity, the feminine, feminist, feminization. The book explores all of this, because one of the things I'm arguing in the book, that we can only reimagine South African Blackness and Afro-Indianness through the positionality of vulnerability. That is the site of possibility through which new social worlds can emerge, right? And vulnerability, a kind of like shared vulnerability, becomes a different way to think about how we relate to each other. And so vulnerability is very, very, failure is very important in the book. Vulnerability, it's a book that, kind of critiques mastery, critiques, like brown over black or black over brown. And it's like, no. And that is why the book is not a comparative analysis, it's a relational analysis. Because comparative analysis always leads us to like mastery and, like binaries that I want to kind of like trouble, to get us to provoke us to think differently. Um, and one of the things that I'm very clear in the book is that we have to hold the tensions together, right? We have to hold the pain and the pleasure. We have to hold uh, like our complicated histories together, right? We don't like erase the kind of like, like the kind of like the anti-Blackness of the Indian community, or the anti-Indianness of the Black community. Like, we have to hold it all together and recognize that this is who we are. And this all emerges out of these histories that we come from. But we have to work through it together, right? And I think that provides a way for me to think about all of this in a much more dynamic way, right? So it's a book that does not sideline anti-Blackness, does not sideline our contested histories, right? But it's a book that puts it all there. And it's like, hey, let's deal with this. Let's work through it, because that's how we're going to work towards creating new worlds. And for me, the erotic becomes very important. The erotic informs and shapes everything that we do, right? The erotic is about feeling, right? And so to me, like, what I'm arguing for is a different way of feeling together. And this takes me to the question around the sensory. So I use the visual as a way to access the senses. So I talk about like Faga's work is really interesting, right? Because they had a performance where, they were performing sex, right? At the sex, it was a show called Sex. And I tried to capture the smell. I tried to capture the feel of sweat sliding off bodies. They ejaculate in the performance. Like I try to, and they have another performance where they are bathing in feces, right? So I show how the visual allows us to access a different sensorial regime. I write about my own experiences, like in Fordsburg, for instance, or in the sugarcane plantations, and I try to capture, like, not just the visual, but the haptic, the the sensory, the taste, the smell, like those kinds of things, because we are in an era of visual fatigue, right? And we need to be able to access our different senses. But it's the different senses, it's the excess, it's the abject in my work that starts bringing us together. It's the kind of total abdication of anything that's normative.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jordache. And any last words, Pralini? You want to add?
I have no last words. Thank you for that, Jordache. It's a lot to mull over, and I like the idea that we can keep questioning, and we need to go into this messy terrain somehow together and hold it all. Thank you so much. It's been a real
Thank you,
pleasure.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. Thank you, Pralini. Thank you, Jordache. Thanks, everyone. It was great. Now come, let us all build a new lexicon.